Namaste, my dear brothers and sisters. The love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch. Now we go to today's subject, which is again on the cardiovascular system. The first part will be relatively basic. We'll talk about the regulation of cardiovascular function and about the physiology of exercise, and then we shall go to diseases, particularly high blood pressure and heart disease. Now, coming to regulation of cardiac function, or cardiovascular function. Uh, we'll focus on the heart, but certainly the blood vessels also need to be regulated. Their diameter needs to grow bigger or smaller. And all these functions need to be regulated because the demand on these structures is not the same all the time. And therefore, they can't just keep functioning at the same pace. The tempo of their functioning has to change from time to time to cope with the demand, extra demand, for example, the demand of exercise or the exercise of high or the challenge of high altitude. To meet all these, the tempo of the function has to keep changing. Having said that, the heart has uh, one important characteristic, and that is automaticity, which means that the heart can beat on its own. Even if you cut off all the nerve supply to the heart continues to beat. And this inbuilt characteristic, of which we talked the other day also when we talk of the SA node discharging impulses apparently spontaneously, which then spread in the heart in such a way that we get a well-coordinated contraction of the atria and the ventricles, the atria, and then after a little delay, both the ventricles. Now, this is something that goes on even if all the nerves supplying the heart are cut off. Now, this again, one can see the wisdom of the Lord who has created us. Heart is a vital organ, and therefore its functioning should not depend upon the presence of nerves. All the same, since it needs to be regulated, it does have nerves which can increase or decrease the pace at which the heart functions. So the regulation is for through the nerves and through the hormones is for regulating the tempo of activity, the pace of activity, not for ensuring the activity itself. And secondly, the division of the nervous system that regulates the heart is called the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic means that this division of the nervous system is not under the control of willpower, which means we don't have to use our willpower to beat the heart. We don't have to use it even to increase or decrease the pace at which the heart beats or the pace or the way the cardiovascular system functions. We don't have to use our willpower to do that. And that again is a great advantage because, firstly, if it will be very difficult for us to calculate from moment to moment what the pace of the activity should be so that the cardiovascular system can perform satisfactorily the function of keeping the environment around the cells constant. That is probably done through a more automated process which uses a complex algorithm and ensures that the pace of activity will be exactly matched with the demand. Secondly, even more importantly, suppose this function were under the control of willpower. And we forget to beat our heart for a minute. We get busy with so many things. Then you can imagine what would happen. So it's good that it functions even without nerves, and even in those parts of the, I mean, those divisions of the nervous system or those endocrines which control the pace of activity of the heart do it without our conscious will. Otherwise, when we take exercise, not only we'll be running, we'll also be thinking of how to change the activity of the heart, how to change the activity of the lungs, how to increase the blood flow through the muscles. We'll be also busy with doing all this using our willpower. We don't have to do that. It happens automatically. So when we say that this activity is not under the control of willpower, it looks like a negative thing, as if, something has been denied to us. But in fact, one can say that this is a division of the nervous system that liberates us from using our willpower for infructuous activities. It liberates us from spending our time and attention and energy on things which can run on their own much better than we will be able to run through using our willpower. So it's a liberation, it's a freedom, it's a greater accuracy that is achieved in the regulation through this autonomic nervous system. But then you'll say that you have heard of some yogis who can control their heartbeat. Yes, they can, but they didn't start walking the path of yoga to be able to do that. That's only a side effect. They don't use it very often, except when compelled by scientists to demonstrate whether they can do it. Occasionally, some yogis have done that, and that's how we know they can do it. But then, we are not talking of those exceptions. To every rule, there is an exception. So, to the rule that autonomic functions cannot be controlled by willpower, that also is a rule with an exception. The only rule without an exception is the rule that all rules have exceptions. So, this is also one of those rules which has an exception. Some exceptional people can control their heartbeat and other autonomic functions. They can even control it to the extent of one side of the body being warm and another side being cold. They can achieve all those miraculous feats. But we are not talking of those exceptions. We are talking of the ordinary person who neither has these powers nor does he care much for them because they will not be of much use to him. And even the yogis did not really embark on the path to be able to do all this. So now, with that further introduction, uh, let's now have a look at what these divisions of the nervous system are, and maybe I'll use a little visual aid in the form of a whiteboard. So the autonomic nervous system has two divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, sympathetic, as the name suggests, becomes more active when we need sympathy. When do we need sympathy? When we are in trouble. Not only necessarily trouble, but when we need to step up certain activities. That is another way to look at it, an emergency or when we are in difficulty. Exercise is also one of those situations in which we need to step up the activity of the heart and the lungs, etc., because the demand in the muscles increases. And therefore, the sympathetic nervous system helps us in coping with that demand. Parasympathetic is, in a way, just the opposite. That's the division of the nervous system that is more active when we are at rest and when we are relaxed. So you can understand that sympathetic would increase the rate of the heart, the force with which the heart beats, and parasympathetic would decrease both these. We'll go to the greater details of this when we go to the nervous system. But at this stage, it's just enough to sort of understand that we have these two divisions regulating the function of the heart and also the blood vessels. Sympathetic in general constricts the blood vessels, makes them narrow, and parasympathetic widens them. And I might say that how would that help? Because actually, say in exercise, in muscles, we need a uh, greater blood flow. For that, the vessels should open up. Now, if sympathetic constricts the blood vessels, that would actually hamper. But then the divine has infinite wisdom packed into our body, and that doesn't happen because of various reasons. One of the most important is that while the sympathetic nerves, most of the places bring about vasoconstriction, the sympathetic nerves which supply these muscles, the skeletal muscles, the muscles which participate in our movements like jogging and swimming, etc., in those muscles, the sympathetic nerves actually dilate the blood vessels. Dilate means open them up so that the blood flow increases. This is in addition to the local mechanisms built into the muscle where increase in the oxygen consumption, increased activity means more oxygen will be consumed by the muscles, and increased carbon dioxide production. Again, increased activity would mean more oxygen used to burn the fuel, that is fuel like glucose, more carbon dioxide produced. So both these things, particularly increase in the carbon dioxide levels, also dilates the blood vessels. So there's a local regulation which will ensure that the muscles which are active, they have an increase in the blood flow, and also the sympathetic nerves, although they are active in the body in general, there's an increase in sympathetic drive. They will dilate the blood vessels, and closely associated with this is the adrenal gland, which will release adrenaline, that also brings about in the skeletal muscles dilatation. It opens up the blood vessels. So all the mechanisms are such that they would increase the blood flow through the muscles which are actually active during exercise. And correspondingly, the sympathetic will help in reducing the blood flow in organs which are not active, like say the gastrointestinal tract, and if it is not very hot, to some extent in the skin. But then the skin does get warm in exercise, so skin is not one of those places where the blood flow suffers much during exercise, but it can be brought down considerably because the skin has a vast vascular bed, and it can be uh, there can be enormous difference between the in the blood flow through the skin when the blood vessels are wide open and when the blood vessels are constricted. Then the gastrointestinal tract, there again we don't need to digest our food when we are taking exercise, and therefore the blood vessels can constrict. So in the viscera and in many other places, the blood vessels are actually constricted during exercise. So this redistribution of blood flow is important, because if the blood vessels were to open every place simultaneously, it will lead to a fall in blood pressure, because there's a limited amount of blood circulating through the body, and uh, you can maintain the blood pressure because there's a limited amount of opening at all the places. So if one place needs to open up much more than normal, other places need to close down to some extent. Otherwise, the blood pressure will fall. You can imagine, a water hose uh, sending water through a large number of pipes which branch out from it. So if you increase the flow through all those pipes, then it will not flow with the same force. If it is flowing out through only a few pipes, then flow will increase. If you send it to all the channels simultaneously, and then the flow will become slower. That's what the blood pressure dropping means. So the blood pressure will drop. And that now you can see the wisdom of the traditional advice, which we are all familiar with, that don't take exercise immediately after a heavy meal, and particularly if you are exposed to the sunlight. So don't go out in the sun after a meal and uh, take heavy exercise, because that will mean increased blood flow through the muscles, increased blood flow through the skin because of the high temperature, and increased blood flow through the gastrointestinal tract, through the stomach and intestines, because of the meal that we have taken. Now you can't have the blood flowing extra amounts of blood flowing through three major vascular trees simultaneously. So that is why it is important to sort of think in terms of that. So that is the regulation of cardiovascular system. Now, heart, we saw that increases its activity as a result of the sympathetic drive that increases the rate of the heart and the force of beating of the heart. Now, that happens not only during exercise, it also happens in other situations. And this is understandable because exercise is only one of the stresses. Fear, anxiety, etc., also a type of stress, and it helps the animal increase the heart rate in anticipation. See, if a deer has seen a tiger, it is afraid, and therefore it will run. Even before it has actually started running, the fear itself will raise the heart rate, which means the adaptation to the exercise which he will now get because of running away from the deer has started even before he has started running. The fear itself has, in anticipation, started regulating the nervous system. In the same way, any type of emotional excitement increases it. Uh, there is a story of a nurse, and I can understand, who, whenever she took the pulse rate of her male patients, subtracted 10 from what she had counted, and she reached the correct heart rate, which anybody else would get on the same patient. Now we go to the physiology of exercise. This background which we have built up now will help us in understanding what happens in exercise. We can discuss this under two headings. One is the acute effect of exercise, and secondly, the long-term effect of regular physical activity, what we call sometimes training. So let's first take the acute effects. Now, as we talked in case of the deer who has to run away from the tiger, in general, the very thought of exercise starts those adaptations which will help us in exercise. Why that happens is that although the control is by the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves are not working in autonomously on their own. They are under the control of the brain, and we'll come to which parts of the brain which we when we go to the nervous system. Let's say they are under the control of the emotional brain, and the higher than the emotional brain is the part that evolved later, and is the thinking brain. And therefore, there's a whole chain. Our thoughts, our emotions, uh, through the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, can affect the functioning of organs like the heart and the lungs. And therefore, the emotions like that of the deer who is afraid of the tiger, or any types of thoughts that a person gets, they can also affect, like the thought of anticipated exercise. So the person thinks that I'll jog, the thinking itself acts through this chain to increase the heart rate, increase the force of beating of the heart, and increase the respiratory rate to some extent. So all these things begin before the exercise actually begins. And once the exercise is actually begun, then this becomes the magnitude of this regulation, the extent to which all these changes come about, they increase further through uh, this nervous mechanism, through the hormones like adrenaline, which are released, and through local factors, as we talked, like the increase in the carbon dioxide production in the muscles, which will increase the blood flow. And then along with this, there's a redistribution of blood flow because of the sympathetic constricting the blood vessels in other places like the gastrointestinal tract and kidneys, etc. So all this will help in coping with the increased requirements of the muscles during exercise. Now let's see a little more, which will help us in understanding a little further that during exercise, yes, we do have an increased demand for oxygen, and to a certain extent, we have seen that it can be uh, matched with the demand by increasing the supply through mechanisms like, say, increase in the rate and force at which the heart beats, the rate and depth of breathing. Now, all these things will compensate. But in very heavy exercise, uh, it may not be possible to still cope. Then, there are metabolic mechanisms in the muscles which will ensure only half the combustion of the fuel. That is, the fuel is not burnt completely up by oxygen into carbon dioxide and water, but part of the combustion, which releases part of the energy from the fuel, is still possible. And then what happens when the person stops that exercise? This uh, fuel, which was partly burnt, is now completely burnt, and we get more energy and we get carbon dioxide and water. So, what is happening in a way is, say, in a 100-meter sprint, the person can't cope with the demand, additional demand, while running. So, while running, what happens is that there's an incomplete combustion of the fuel, and uh, the result is that the person now has built up what is called an oxygen debt. That is, it will pay off this debt when it stops this exercise, get that oxygen which could not be consumed during the exercise itself. That is how it pays off the debt. And this type of exercise is called anaerobic. Anaerobic means the all the additional demand could not be met during the exercise. It will be paid off later on by paying off the oxygen debt. In contrast, our aerobic exercises, which you've heard of, aerobics, is a common term which is used. This exercise is not so severe as to uh, need that oxygen debt. Whatever is the additional demand is met with during the exercise itself. So that is an aerobic exercise. Another thing which will help us in understanding when we go further to the effect of training is the fact that the heart beats faster and more forcefully. What does it lead to? It increases what we call the cardiac output. That is the output of the ventricles as they pump the blood. Which ventricles? We need additional blood flow through the organs, so the left ventricle needs to pump harder. and faster. But then that happens in both the ventricles simultaneously. If one ventricle beats faster and harder, the other also does. We saw those Purkinje fibers uh, branching off uh, from those two branches from the bundle of his, going to both the ventricles and spreading the impulse. Why that is important is because the left ventricle can pump that additional blood only if additional blood returns to it. And where is the blood returning from? It's returning from the lungs. And to return additional blood from the lungs, the right ventricle, which is sending the blood to the lungs, also needs to beat faster and harder. So the output of both the ventricles is matched. It's exactly equal. And that is how the heart can continue circulating that blood. So, in other words, what we are trying to reach is that as a result of a certain heart rate and a certain amount of blood which is pumped with each beat, the increase in the force of beating will increase the amount that is pumped out with each beat. That is called the stroke volume. Now, the product of these two, that is the one multiplied by the other, is what gives us the cardiac output. Okay. So that is the cardiac output. Now, this cardiac output can be seen, in terms of an analogy like walking. The actual sort of progress that we make in terms of walking would depend upon the rate at which take the steps and how big each step is. So heart rate is like the frequency with which we take the steps, and stroke volume is the length of each step, how big each step is. And the two together will determine our speed of walking, or you can say in this case, the cardiac output. Now you can also understand that to some extent, increasing both will increase the cardiac output more. But there'll come a point where if you take if you are if you take the steps very frequently, hmm, you take the steps too frequently, then the steps can't be very big. So the length of the steps will go down. So you have to strike a compromise where you get the best in terms of combining both these things. You can't walk beyond a certain pace. That is, you can't take the steps more frequently beyond a point, uh, because then the uh, distance covered in each step will start going down. That happens also in the case of the heart. The maximum heart rate, which is useful for increasing the cardiac output, is 180 per minute in young people. And therefore, during exercise, if the heart rate goes above 180, it will actually not increase the cardiac output, and the body has adaptations to ensure that that will not happen. That is again a part of the regulatory mechanisms. So we'll get the best combination by going up to a heart rate of 180, and with that, it is possible to get the maximum stroke volume which our heart is capable of. Our heart, because that will depend upon the strength of the heart muscles. Just as how much weight you can lift will depend upon the strength of the arm muscles. How big steps we can take will depend upon the strength of the leg muscles. And in the same way, how much the heart can pump with each beat will depend upon the strength of the heart muscle, the thickness of the heart muscle. So that is what stroke volume, that's how stroke volume need not be the same in everybody. So that is the concept of the cardiac output. Now with this, now we can go to the long-term effects of exercise, that is training. And to understand that, let's see the cardiac output in an average healthy person who is not necessarily very athletic by nature, doesn't take very regular exercise. And this is the heart rate on this side. Say this is 0, 60, 120, 180. Beyond this will not be useful, we saw. And this side, we have the stroke volume. Now, normally at rest, when we are at rest, an average person say has a heart rate of about 70. to a little above 60. And on stroke volume, say suppose we put 50, 100, 150. Now, an average person at rest has a heart rate, say, of about 70 and a stroke volume of about 70 milliliters. Volume, heart rate per minute. So 70 multiplied by 70 gives us 4,900 milliliters, which means an average person has a cardiac output of about 4,900 milliliters, or to round it up, 5 liters per minute, because the heart rate is per minute. So every minute, the ventricle, be it the right, be it the left, either ventricle pumps out about 5 liters of blood. Now, when this person starts taking exercise, the maximum useful heart rate is 180. Suppose he takes maximal exercise and he achieves a heart rate of 180. And the maximum stroke volume that he will be able to achieve is about 100. So, as a result, now the cardiac output has gone in this person from 5 liters a minute to 18 liters a minute. So you can see the enormous increase that take place. So all this is held in reserve. We have that much reserve. Okay. And that is what will become relevant when we come to heart disease. In heart disease, the person may not feel anything at rest, because in any case, we have a lot of reserve, and the person might have only have a reduced reserve, and therefore the symptoms will be felt only during exercise. But then what happens in a person who is trained, who takes exercise regularly to get exercise training? For this person also, the maximum heart rate is 80, and the maximum possible stroke volume is higher than 100. But one more adaptation takes place. His resting heart rate is generally lower, say about 50. About 50, and he achieves the same resting cardiac output, because his requirements are the same and as that of any other person at rest, say about 5 liters. So he achieves these 5 liters by, say, 50 multiplied by 100, 50 per minute heart rate and 100 milliliters of stroke volume. So this is how he stays at rest. But when he takes his maximal exercise, for him also the maximum heart rate is 180, and the max, because his cardiac muscles has become thicker and stronger, like the arm muscles becoming thicker and stronger in a weightlifter. So his heart can pump, say, 140 or 150 milliliters with each beat. So now his cardiac output has gone from resting 5 liters to about 25 liters. This 180 multiplied by 150 or 140 will give about 25 liters. And absolutely top athletes can achieve cardiac outputs of even 40 or 50 liters per minute. Okay. So this is the effect of training. But then you'll see that this has been achieved mainly by increase in the stroke volume. Instead of 100, his maximum is about 150. But to some extent, it has been achieved by a reduction in the resting heart rate. What happens is, as a result of that, is this possibility of increasing the cardiac output by increasing the heart rate is greater for him. He has a greater margin available. So instead of contributing to the increase in cardiac output from 70 to 180, he is increasing it from 50 to 180. So that side also he gets an additional 130. When you multiply the heart rate by the stroke volume, he gets 130. A person whose resting heart rate is 70, he gets only 110 contributed to the product from the heart rate. So his reserve has gone up because of both partly a reduction in the resting heart rate and partly increase in the stroke volume. So now you can understand the usual thing which is known. Why do the top athletes, have a lower resting heart rate? They have a lower resting heart rate because they have the same demands at rest as other people. Their heart is beating at a slower rate, but then they are pumping out a little more with each heartbeat, which is not difficult for them because their heart muscles have become very strong. So it can easily pump 100 milliliters with each stroke. And that's why they are able to be at rest, have at rest the same amount of blood flow as an other person. But then this gives them an advantage during heavy exercise when they are doing their peak, putting in their peak effort, because that increases the margin through which the heart rate can increase and contribute to the cardiac output. Now, all these things will become a little more relevant again when we talk about some of the things like sudden death in an athlete during exercise itself, why that happens. Now, let's go from here to just two more things in relation to this, and that is two types of muscle training. One is called endurance training. That is to be able to sustain additional effort for a long time. Say a person has to train for a 40 kilometers race, marathons. That requires endurance. And the adaptations, some of the adaptations which are peculiar to this are that as a result of this training, the vascularity of the muscles increases. That is, the muscles have more blood vessels, a richer network of blood vessels. Their blood vessels develop the capacity to develop to extract more oxygen from the same blood. So more vascularity, greater, more richer tree, more oxygen extraction. That is, they are able to extract from the blood more oxygen. We need to leave behind less in the venous blood that flows out, and they develop an extra glycogen reserve. Glycogen is the storage form of carbohydrate in the muscles. That reserve fuel increases. So this is what happens in endurance type of training. The other type of training is what we call strength training. Let's say in weightlifting. Now, strength training is different in character. It's conducted differently. And this leads mainly to an increase in the size of the muscles which are used. Muscle become fat and bulgy, say the arm muscles in case of a weightlifter. This increase in the size of muscles is called hypertrophy. Hyper, is increase in something. This is hypertrophy. Atrophy, is withering away, becoming smaller. Hypertrophy is becoming bigger. So this is what happens in them. Now, can anybody, through proper type of training, become a top athlete or a top person in competitive sports in either endurance or strength? That is not true, because training, the type of training that they get is only part of the story. What contributes in addition to this training is a genetic makeup, which means some people are genetically more fit for endurance type of training and some people are genetically more fit for strength type of training. To start with, a child who is going to go for competitive sports will show additional competence or will be extremely good at sports in general. Then, through trial and error, as the person grows up as a young person, realizes that this is the type of sports that I am a little better at. This is what suits me better. And then that person can go in for strength training or endurance training, depending upon whatever suits that person better. What all sports can do to the country. Yesterday, the Honorable Prime Minister was talking in Gujarat, where he had gone to inaugurate the national games. And so you can see sports are becoming more and more, we are becoming more and more aware of the importance of sports. And Sri Aurobindo has also talked about the importance of sports in school for everybody, because apart from making us physically more fit, they also inculcate a sportsman spirit, which is helpful not only in sports, but in life in general. So that is the endurance type of training and the strength type of training. And a person who is physically sort of capable of going to the top in competitive sports also is not made equally fit for both. That depends on the genes, and therefore the child and his teachers and parents have to discover what this child is best suited for and give that type of training so that the person can go to the top. So now with this, we'll step out of the whiteboard and go to the PowerPoint. And in the meantime, if you have any questions in what we have talked so far, we can have a little question break. Any questions in the chat? I was speaking so fast, there was no time to type any questions. But if you have any questions, and you can switch on your videos as much as you can, because It's nice to talk to people who can be seen rather than black rectangles, and then ask a question if you have any.
Namaste, sir.
Namaste.
Why people die during exercise in gym?
That we'll come to. I have given some hints now. We'll
Okay.
come to in the PowerPoint presentation. That's
Okay,
what is
sir.
called the
Thank
sports paradox. Why the
Sports
sports
paradox.
paradox? Nobody
Yeah.
knows all the reasons for it. There are many hypotheses, but I'll give you one or two reasons why that may happen. Anything else? We
There's
all
one.
become more conscious of it after Raju Srivastav, this accident. But
Yes, there's.
this was not the only case. Off and on, such cases have been happening in the past also.
Okay, can I read something from the chart?
Sure.
Yeah. Sometimes schools and schedules reduce the time for proper meals as they run from school to training and matches. How to plan their meals adequately?
You mean balancing the requirement of food and the exercise? Well, in terms of, we find it very helpful at this moment to turn to Ayurveda. In terms of Ayurveda, we don't need too many meals a day. So if the child has had a good breakfast and is looking forward to a good lunch, the meals can be ignored, and at the most, a light snack is okay, which will not interfere with the exercise being soon after the meals. Because in schools, there is a compulsion. All the children cannot be playing at the same time. So there may be a sports period for which may come for some children soon after the interval or the recess or the snack break, whatever you call it. So after that, it may come. But then if the snack is light, and particularly children have such good adaptation to everything, their body is so resilient that after a light snack, they can still take pretty heavy exercise. Uh, but I think a bigger tragedy is that than this, that is combining it with the meals, how to combine it with the meals, is that as the children go to higher classes, the curriculum becomes heavy. And one of the first casualties is the sports period. And that is really unfortunate because we treat physical training or physical activity to be an extracurricular subject. It's not extracurricular, it's strictly curricular. Because apart from keeping the child fit, which will help the child in the studies, which we consider real studies, the academic part, for that also child has to be physically fit. Apart from that, it inculcates sportsman spirit. And in fact, it has been seen that children who are physically fit through regular physical activity do better in general, also in academics. So this traditional notion that if the child spends time on this, then it will be at the expense of academics and so on and so forth, that is not really supported neither by uh, a little deeper philosophy nor by whatever studies have been done in this area. So the schools have to become more conscious of not treating sports, and equally, this is not the right time, so I'll not digress upon it, dilate upon it. Equally, not to treat music, art, dance, drama, and all those things also as extracurricular. All these things are strictly curricular, and they contribute to the development of the child in important ways. Okay.
And the next thing is in the chat box. Did I understand this right? One should not go into the sun after a meal. Is that why they say after lunch, rest a while, after dinner, walk a mile?
Well, there is a little internal contradiction there. After lunch, rest a while. Yes, and one can understand, especially in the heat, one should not go out. And in the afternoon, it's likely to be hot. At night, it may not be hot, but then why exercise soon after a meal? Uh, Firstly, apart from other things, it might also provide a little time for socializing for the family if they go out for a walk together. Also, it that walk is never a brisk walk. What is recommended is a stroll, and that is okay. And most people can stand that. But if one person finds that even that is challenging, then the person need not go for a stroll and take care of the cardiac problem, which is making it difficult for to go even for that uh, type of a stroll after dinner. Uh, how do we know it? Uh, when the heart starts complaining. So even with mild exertion, if this person feels that there is some discomfort in the chest, then the person knows that I'm crossing my limits. And if even that much is giving, then the person needs attention. Anything else?
That's all in the chat box.
Okay, so then we can go to the PPT and we'll have one more opportunity when we go to. I'm trying not to go to the full screen so that I can see you, and I'll move your window to the side of the screen where the slide is not there. And I use fairly big fonts, so you should be able to see the slide even if I don't go full screen. And for the same reason, as far as possible, keep your videos on. So today our focus is on disease rather than on health. But of course, what we talked so far was mainly health. Now we'll focus more mainly on disease. The mother of most cardiovascular diseases is overweight. So that is the fundamental sort of thing which one can keep in mind. And very often, people go in for all types of tests to find out how much I'm at risk of heart disease. Not only blood cholesterol and triglyceride levels, but also the various fractions of cholesterol and the various types of lipoproteins and C-reactive protein and this and so on, which are there in the blood in milligram and sometimes nanogram quantities, all those markers. Why do you ignore the marker for which you need not go to any lab, which is staring at us in kilogram quantities? That is the major risk. Many people with high blood pressure or diabetes who are in borderline, not all of them, borderline hypertension and borderline diabetes will be able to reach their normal blood pressure and normal blood sugar levels just by losing 5 kilos of weight. They did not even become skinny. They did not lose all the extra weight. Whatever additional weight they are carrying, say 10 or 20 kilos, out of that, if they lose 5 kilos, they'll see a remarkable difference in their blood pressure and blood glucose levels. So if they were borderline, it will come down to normal. If they were not borderline, at least they will need less medication. So that is the importance of the body weight. Now we go to hypertension. Hypertension, as everybody knows now, is high blood pressure. Which place in the body is the blood pressure high? In the arteries. There is some pressure in all the blood vessels. Arteries, capillaries, veins, they also have a pressure. But when we say high blood pressure, it means high pressure in the arteries, particularly the big arteries, because the aorta has a certain pressure. The aorta is the big artery into which the left ventricle pumps blood. That branches out into first big arteries. Now, these big arteries have more or less the same pressure as the aorta. And that is what we measure. Most of the time we measure it in the arm. So we measure it in the brachial artery, which is here on the front of the elbow. That is where we generally measure. It's one of the big arteries. So it is in these big arteries, the pressure of the blood in these big arteries is what we call blood pressure. And when it is higher than normal, we say hypertension. Why does it happen? Why does hypertension develop? Or sort of why is this blood pressure develop at all? Why is there pressure in the arteries? The pressure in the arteries is because of the pumping action of the left ventricle. So the left ventricle pumps blood at a certain pressure and that gets transmitted to the arteries. However, the blood pumped out by the left ventricle is intermittent. When the ventricle contracts, the blood is being pumped. When it is relaxing, no blood is being pumped. And we saw how it is converted into a continuous flow in the arteries, which is important for the blood to keep flowing throughout the vascular tree, even when the ventricles are relaxing. It is converted into a continuous flow because of the elasticity of the arteries. You know what happens because the elasticity is that when the blood is pumped in, not only it flows forwards, the artery also expands. The elastic nature makes it expand. So the pressure is not fully transmitted, somewhat diluted. And then what happens when the ventricle is relaxing and there's no flow, this starts closing in on the blood. The elastic recoil brings it back. And that ensures that the pressure will still be there and the flow will continue. So while in the ventricles, the fluctuation is from 120 to 0, 120 during contraction, 0 millimeters mercury during relaxation. In the arteries, it generally fluctuates between 120 and 80. So intermittent flow from the ventricles is converted into a continuous flow through the arteries. Now, what is it that leads to hypertension? You can understand that one reason could be a reduction in the elasticity of the arteries. Because you know what is buffering the impact of the forceful pumping is the elasticity, because when the blood vessel expands, that buffers that effect. And therefore, the reduction in the elasticity can also lead to hypertension, which happens with age. And the second factor could be spasm. Spasm means a narrowing down, the diameter becoming smaller. And that happens in a variety of situations, particularly anger, fear, pain, etc. At least mild pain. Very severe pain may lead to just the opposite, dilatation, and therefore a person may faint because of extremely severe pain. But these are some of the situations, which means it doesn't necessarily have to be exercise or some such thing. Exercise will increase the blood flow in some places, reduce in another. So overall effect on blood pressure is not that much. But pure spasm in large many vasculatories, as may happen during anger, fear, pain, etc., that spasm itself can raise the blood pressure, narrowing of the vessels. You can understand if there's a pump which is pumping the blood through a set of tubes. If you put a nozzle in front of the tubes, nozzle reduces the diameter. The pipe is this big, but the nozzle has a hole only this much. So because of that nozzle, you find the water flows out with much greater force. That force corresponds to the pressure. So spasm can increase the blood pressure in which the blood flows through the arteries. Then increased flow. For example, during exercise, at least in a large vascularity in the muscles, the blood flow increases. That also you can understand with the same analogy. If you make the pump uh, force more water into the pipes so that the flow through the pipes increases, that will also raise the pressure. And closely related to spasm are the deposits. Spasm, is a temporary narrowing. The muscle contracts, the diameter becomes less. The cause for the narrowing is gone. The person is at peace again. The person was angry, but no longer angry. Now the blood vessels dilates again. So this was a temporary effect because of the contraction of the muscles, and relaxation will follow, and that will reduce the spasm. Deposit is a relatively permanent feature, which means that fatty deposits in the arteries uh, will reduce the diameter. So again, it's a reduction in diameter, but this is relatively permanent. Now, this is a process which starts pretty early in life, because the fatty deposits form only on damaged arteries, and certain amount of damage takes place very early in life. And on that damaged area, not only fats, but a mixture of other blood cells, etc., quite a bit of a complex hodgepodge mixture deposits, which narrows down the diameter. And this is what we call is the process of atherosclerosis. Now, the beginning of atherosclerosis is very early in life. The earliest sign of damage is what are called fatty streaks in the arteries, and that can be seen in children as young as 5 years of age. And if the lifestyle continues to be unhealthy and the person is genetically more prone to heart disease and other such problems, then the process of atherosclerosis can be pretty fast, with the result that by the time the person is 30 or 40 years old, there may be some symptoms because of the fatty deposits in certain parts of the body, generally the heart, but it could be the kidneys or the brain. These are some of the areas which are more prone to showing up as manifestations of these deposits. The process is generalized. It can happen anywhere, everywhere. But the effects are seen maximum in certain types of places which are more vital and which have some other characteristics, as we shall see. So those are the places which show. For example, it can happen also in the arteries which supply the back. So if it happens in the arteries which supply the back, the person is more prone to get back pain. A little movement, unaccustomed movement, and the person says, "Oh, I hardly did anything. I just picked up a pen from the floor and I got such a severe pain. And now I have to get physiotherapy for 2 weeks." Now, why did that happen? That happened partly because the person was sedentary by habits. Of course, back pain itself is a lifestyle problem, so everything contributes. But one reason which could have contributed is that his blood flow to the back was already compromised because of the narrowing of these arteries. But then we don't call it a back attack. The same thing happens in the heart, we call it a heart attack. If the same thing happens in the back, we don't call it a back attack. Why? Because it is not life threatening. The person will not die because of it. Heart is a vital organ. If the same thing happens in the heart, the person may die. Back attack will not kill him, so we don't even call it an attack. But the process is similar. So atherosclerosis is a generalized process. It happens all over the body, but then it shows up as symptoms only in a few selected areas. And one of the ways it shows up, before it shows up in any place like the brain or the kidneys or the heart, is in the form of high blood pressure, because at least the diameter is narrow. And narrowing the diameter of the blood vessels, particularly the arteries, particularly the arteries which offer maximum resistance, which are a little after the big arteries in the tree. In these arteries, if there's a narrowing, it will show up as high blood pressure. And therefore, high blood pressure becomes a warning for other things which may follow, because the process is generalized. It's reflecting a generalized process. So it becomes a warning for other things which may follow, like heart disease, kidney disease, or stroke. And in fact, for stroke, hypertension is a major risk factor. Once I heard a cardiologist, a very famous cardiologist, you might have heard of him, Professor Srinath Reddy. He said there are 3 risk factors for stroke. The first is high blood pressure, the second is high blood pressure, and the third is high blood pressure. So these are the 3 risk factors for heart disease. I don't know whether Aditi was laughing or sneezing, but at least it triggered something. God bless you. Okay. Now, why is hypertension called a silent killer? Because of its complications. Because by itself, high blood pressure may not have symptoms. But complications like stroke and other things which I think which may follow, it is the beginning of the process, which might show up because of the same type of narrowing which has now caused blood pressure. It may lead to showing up in other organs. It is because of that it is called a silent killer, because start with high blood pressure may show no symptoms at all, apart from sometimes a little headache and so on. But there may be no symptoms at all. And what are these complications? Heart disease, stroke. For stroke, it's the major risk factor. Blindness, retinopathy, that is the arteries in the eyes having a similar process. And kidney disease, again, because the blood vessels supplying the kidneys, the arteries supplying the kidney, going through a similar process. So these are the 4 major complications of high blood pressure. And which one will show up in which person? That depends on the weak point of the person, because genetically we have a greater tendency to have a disease in one organ rather than the other. How do we treat hypertension? The first thing is to make sure, is it really hypertension? Because we saw that anger, anxiety, etc., can also give rise to an increase in the blood pressure, which is because of spasm, which is a temporary problem. After the spasm is gone, the blood vessels will become wider, and the cause for the blood pressure will be gone. And therefore, we have to make sure it is really hypertension, which means a single casual visit to a doctor and the doctor finding high blood pressure does not mean that the person actually has high blood pressure. There's something called the white coat hypertension. Doctors generally have a white coat. And being in front of a person with a white coat who can make all types of dire pronouncements about all the risks that we run of getting this disease or that makes the person anxious and afraid of what is hiding in my body, which this person in a white coat might reveal. That itself can raise the blood pressure. So therefore, what is done is, firstly, the doctor tries to put the patient at ease before taking the blood pressure. Secondly, that makes the person come a few times again and again, so that the person gets used to the doctor and the surroundings, and also has been reassured by the doctor that your hypertension may not be really permanent. It might have been a temporary increase in hypertension, increase in blood pressure during the first visit. It may even be what is called labile hypertension, that it comes and goes. So every time you're under stress, you have it, even when you're not in the doctor's office. And when you're not under stress, you don't have it. So that is labile hypertension. But when this labile hypertension becomes too frequent, that is, these peaks become too frequent, which will happen if the person is repeatedly under stress, then these peaks can join and become a steady high blood pressure. That is one of the theories. of high blood pressure might become constant. It starts with these peaks every time a person is under stress, and then these peaks get like the dots, like a dotted line, they join and become steady. And any theory is good enough, because by and large, doctors say that most cases of hypertension have what is called idiopathic hypertension or essential hypertension. Idiopathic and essential refer to the fact that nobody knows what the cause is. So these high sounding words like essential and idiopathic, they hide the doctor's ignorance, the ignorance of the medical science. We don't know why it is there. So if it is, we don't know why it is there, any theory is good enough. And this is one of the theories put forth by a heart physiologist, George Pickering, or maybe he was a physician or physiologist, George Pickering. He said that these peaks, they can become steady, and therefore, first thing is avoid stress. Yeah? So if the peaks are only once in a while, far few and far between, which will happen to any one of us, then they will not get a steady high blood pressure. It will just remain labile hypertension, which probably all of us have. And therefore, it's important to make sure, is it really hypertension? The next point is, if it is really hypertension, there are two approaches. One is medication, and the other is to go to the root of the issue. These are not mutually exclusive. There's a very common tendency to say, I don't want to take drugs. These allopathic drugs are very strong. They have so many side effects. They tell me some yogic exercises, those 3 postures or 20 minutes of meditation, will it bring my blood pressure down? It's a very common tendency. We talked about the process of atherosclerosis, which leads to the narrowing, which leads to the fatty deposit. Starts at the age of 5, accelerates in those who are who have a faulty lifestyle, who are more stressed, and so on and so forth. So it has taken probably 30 years to reach the stage now. Do you think that 20 minutes of meditation will undo the effects of 30 years? What has been going on in the body for 30 years? It's asking for too much from too little. Okay. So don't blame meditation or the yogic postures. Firstly, look at lifestyle as a whole. Secondly, even lifestyle as a whole has done that damage over 30 years. So damage which is accumulated over 30 years cannot be reversed in a day. Reversal can take place, but it may take at least 5 years. But you may not have that much time. You may not have that much time, because during those 5 years, there may be one of those complications like stroke or losing your eyesight. So what is the solution then? Medication. It will bring down the blood pressure the next day. The very next day, the blood pressure will come down. It's something like this. Suppose the roof of this room is leaking. It's rainy season. One way to deal with it is to employ a set of 3 boys who will keep wiping the floor continuously to keep it dry. One boy is tired, his duty is over after 8 hours, the next boy takes over and he continues. So 3 boys, 24 hours, you can keep the floor dry. The second approach is repair the roof. Now, having these 3 boys is like something quick, immediate, it will work immediately, but it is not going to the root of the issue. Okay. So 3 boys may be like 3 tablets, each tablet having a duration of action of 8 hours. So 3 tablets a day, the effect of 1 tablet is gone. 1 tablet is tired, 1 boy is tired, give the duty to the next one, the next tablet. Okay. So that is like that. But then it has a place, because that is the only way you can keep the floor dry immediately on a short-term basis. But then you can't go on doing that indefinitely. You have to go to the root of the issue. Root of the issue is the damage, the factors which led to that damage over a period of 30 years. Start reversing those, start correcting those. If you do that, after 5 years, or maybe even less, you may find that your blood pressure with the same dose of medication may now be lower than normal. When it becomes lower than normal, the doctor knows now I have to reduce the dose. He reduces the dose, still the blood pressure goes down. Ultimately, there may be a time comes when you need not take the tablets. And therefore, on one hand, the either or approach is wrong. On the other hand, to believe that once medication has been started, it will continue throughout life is also wrong. Why? Because it doesn't have to continue throughout life. The process can be reversed. It will not take 30 years to reverse. It will take much less time than that. For example, if a person has been smoking for 30 years, it has been shown that after about 10 years, if he stops smoking, his risk for heart disease and high blood pressure is comparable to a non-smoker's risk. So the effect of 30 years of smoking can be reversed in 10 years. So reversal takes less time than the process of the disease developing, but same time it takes time. And that's why it is important. So lifelong medication may not be required, but same time medication for a limited period may be required. So it's not an either or approach. And same time, one should not feel that it's axiomatic that once I've started treatment for hypertension, now it is going to be there lifelong. You'll say, well, what is the harm? Taking the medication lifelong is easier than making all those difficult, complex lifestyle changes. Because the medication is taking care of only one manifestation of that unhealthy lifestyle. It does not prevent the person from getting other manifestations like diabetes, etc. Which means that why not follow an approach which will not only reduce the dependence on medication, but will also reduce the possibility of future diseases, the diseases that the person might develop in future. And if you follow the comprehensive approach of yoga, then not only it makes the person relatively less likely to get any diseases in the future, it also gives the person a happier and more meaningful life, which is something which all of us want. So why not use the disease as an opportunity for shifting to a lifestyle based on yoga, which will take care of the present disease, which will take care of diseases which might develop in future, and which will give me all the things like uh, freedom from stress, filling life with love, peace, and joy and fulfillment, which all of us are looking for. Why not use this as an opportunity to discover that type of a lifestyle? In fact, some of the patients come up with this on their own. I remember one patient in the integral health clinic, which we had started in AIMS. On the last day, we used to have a chit chat with the participants. And one of them said, I wish I had come to this place much earlier, then I wouldn't have got high blood pressure. The other one told him, if you had not got high blood pressure, how would you have come here? Now, from this interaction, the patient, one of the patients uh, said something, and the other showed him that this was a good opportunity for you to come here. If you had not got high blood pressure, then you wouldn't have come to this clinic. Now we switch gears to heart disease. And the process, is similar to what happens elsewhere. These fatty deposits in the arteries, which narrow down the diameter of these blood vessels, narrow down the passage. Now that can happen not only elsewhere and give high blood pressure, it can also happen in the heart. And just as a reminder, this is what you saw last time also in the last class. These are the coronary arteries and the coronary veins on the veins. So these are the arteries. And right at the beginning of the aorta, the heart gives off these two arteries, which then branch off to supply the whole heart. And the heart needs this independent blood supply, although it is full of blood all the time, as we saw last time, because the muscles of the heart are rather thick, and the blood in the cavity of the heart will not be able to diffuse and supply the cells throughout the thickness of the wall of the heart. So, like a banker, I gave you that Deepak Chopra's analogy also last time, that like a banker who's surrounded by money all the time still needs a salary. So the heart may be full of blood all the time, but it needs its independent blood supply. And these arteries are prone to the same type of narrowing as the arteries elsewhere. But in the heart, they matter more than many other places. Why? The process of atherosclerosis is generalized, but in the heart matters more. Firstly, because it's a vital organ. As I said, if same thing happens in the back, it is not life-threatening. But if the same thing happens in the heart, it is life-threatening. So it's a vital organ. Life depends upon its continuing to function, and therefore in the heart it matters more. Secondly, while the heart has plenty of reserve in many ways, in one respect it has a little defect. Its arteries are what are called end arteries. End arteries are those which supply only a limited area in the body. Now, in some parts of the body, what we have is, say, if there are two arteries, they have a certain area in which they supply, but then there's an overlap, which means that if there's a block in one of these arteries, the neighboring artery, which is not blocked, will be enough to supply nutrition to this area. So if there's a block here in this artery, this will be able to supply here. And what about this place? There'll be another artery on this side, which will then supply this part. So the two neighboring arteries will be able to meet the requirements of the entire area, which was being supplied by this artery. Now, this type of channels are called anastomotic channels, or cross connections, and overlapping areas of blood supply, whatever you like to call it. All these things are true to some extent. So here there is no problem. But the heart has end arteries, which means that if these are the two arteries, then they have their independent areas of supply. So if there's a block here, this part will die and only this part will get. So dil ki arteries ka dil bada nahi hai. They are very individualistic. They take care of their own territory, not the neighbor. However, again, this is not absolute. In case of damage, in case of a problem, if the blood supply to one part of the heart starts going down, then, like not a very good neighbor, but all the same, a neighbor who has finer feelings, the neighboring artery comes to the rescue. So suppose there's a block here in the heart, in the arteries of the heart. Now, this dotted area is the area that has suffered because of this damage. Now, what this artery does is to give off branches which will supply this area. Now, this type of development is what is called development of collateral circulation. And what is the stimulus for developing collaterals? One is this block. The second is physical activity. Because what will happen is at rest, even with this damage, the person will not feel anything because the demands of the heart, demands on the heart are low. But once there is a exercise, the demand increases, then there's a challenge. And this challenge will stimulate the formation of these collaterals. But how much challenge? Enough to stimulate the collaterals, but not so much as to kill the person because of this damaged part of the heart. So that is where the trick comes in. And therefore, the person has to know what my limits are, where to stop. Don't stop at a level at which absolutely nothing happens, there's no challenge. At the same time, don't go to a level which will damage this. Now, what that level is, we'll not go into the details. It cannot be absolute, but then there are guidelines available in terms of what the maximum permissible heart rate for this person is. That is one of the indications that now the person has reached his limits, because initially it will show up by increasing the heart rate. So that is one of the things. And the doctor, particularly after doing a stress test, can give you better ideas on how much challenge is good for you for developing these collaterals and how much challenge could be dangerous. So that is what these collaterals are. So these can develop, and that is the saving grace. And that is why we end arteries heart, yes, but there is a ray of hope that is also there because of the development of these collaterals, which take time to develop. They develop slowly, but they develop as a result of the challenge posed by the damaged area and the challenge posed by exercise, which increases the demand, so that because of this damage, now there is a challenge. The heart is finding it difficult to cope with that exercise, and that itself becomes a stimulus for developing these collaterals. Here's another picture. I'm emphasizing this because it's a very important point. This is a normal circulation. Now, there is a damage here. So you can see a little bluing instead of red. And then these collaterals have developed from the neighboring area. So, blood was flowing from here to here like this. Now, because of this block, it is not developing. But it can always come like this and still go to those areas where this was going. So that is what the collaterals are like. This is I picked up from a Google search, and I like the title of the image. It comes from Harvard Health and something to do with the Harvard Medical School, I'm sure. The title they're giving it is Do It Yourself Bypass. So you're creating a bypass in a way, bypassing the obstacle by developing these collaterals. And who does it for you? Not the doctor, you yourself, by taking regular physical exercise. So that's why they've called it Do It Yourself Bypass. Okay. And this answers one of the common questions. How much of a block gives symptoms? In coronary angiography, when the angiogram, you have an angiogram in front of you, one can see the degree of narrowing because of these deposits in the arteries. And then the report comes in the form of this artery is blocked to the extent of 70%, this one to the extent of 80%, this one to the extent of 90%. And if a person has triple vessel disease, 3 vessels, major vessels are blocked to the extent of 90%. the person is told you have triple vessel disease with 90% block. The person almost dies out of fear. But this person has been taking regular physical activity. One question he can ask is, then how is it that it was detected only on a routine checkup and I didn't have any symptoms? I hardly have any symptoms. Even with 90% block, there may be no symptoms because the person was physically active. And while the damage was developing, he was also developing collaterals. I know of a 70-year-old man who once went to Dr. Venugopal, who was the head of the thoracic surgery department those days, and showed him his angiogram and told him that I have 90% block. Do you think I need a bypass surgery? But then this person was physically active, athletic by nature, and still was able to walk a decent distance at a fast pace without any problem. What did Dr. Venugopal tell him? Dr. Venugopal told him, we treat patients. We don't treat angiograms. No surgery. Okay. And let me tell you who that patient was. The patient is no more. He was Professor Gulzar Singh China, Professor of Physiology at AIIMS. Then retired when he went to Dr. Venugopal, and he lived, I think, nearly 20 years after Dr. Venugopal told him, we treat patients, we don't treat angiograms. He lived nearly 20 years without surgery after that. What happens in coronary artery disease? Basically, what happens is there's an imbalance between demand and supply. Demand that the heart makes because of the demands of the body, particularly muscles, and the supply in terms of how much the blood vessels can open up to increase the blood flow when the demand is increased. One of the manifestations is angina. The person walks, and if the walk is too brisk, after a certain distance, the person feels pain, usually on the left side of the chest, but need not be on the left side of the chest. The typical textbook description is left side of the chest radiating to the left arm. But then the patient doesn't read the textbook before developing symptoms. Patients show all types of variations. And a very well-known cardiologist, again at AIIMS, who is also unfortunately no more, Professor Rajan Tandon, taught us that any pain between the manubrium sterni, that is this part of the neck, right up to the pubic symphysis, that is the lowest part of the abdomen, any pain in this area is cardiac if it, or may be cardiac, you have to rule out cardiac pain if it comes on exertion and is relieved by rest. So in this entire area, anywhere if there's a discomfort which is precipitated by exercise, which comes on exertion and is relieved by rest, then it could be originating in the heart. This has become important because some people ignore pain in the stomach area. Doctors also sometimes feel it may be gastritis. Well, maybe okay to treat it as gastritis for some time. But if the pain persists, then even in such a person, one should investigate heart disease. And this is, for some strange reason, more common in women than in men to have gastric symptoms rather than pain or discomfort in the chest radiating to the arm. So that is called angina. The second thing is myocardial infarction. Infarction means a dead area, which means a relatively sudden and complete block to a certain part of the heart, which has killed that part of the heart muscle. That is a heart attack. Angina is generally not fatal. It develops slowly. The person gradually feels that I can't walk even this much. Something is happening. So they may go to a doctor. But the two are related. Of course, both are because of a block. But myocardial infarction is an attack. The person may not be aware of it earlier, as I said, because of no symptoms. The person was not making any additional demands on the heart. The block was developing. The person suddenly discovers through the heart attack or a sudden block. Now, why this sudden block? One of the things which can bring about a sudden reduction in the blood supply is that the blood vessels suddenly become narrow. So there was a partial block already there. Superimposed on that is a further block because of the narrowing. And we saw narrowing can be because of a variety of factors like, say, anger, etc. So sudden reduction may be due to a sudden narrowing, which is what we call spasm. So a spasm superimposed on a partial block, the partial block was already there because of the deposits. Sudden spasm superimposed on a partial block can precipitate an attack. So the important thing is what is it that can lead to this type of a spasm? Spasm may be induced by acute mental trauma. When Sri Aurobindo's father was told that the ship in which Sri Aurobindo was returning from England has gone down, it has sunk, it was assumed that Sri Aurobindo was on that ship and therefore would have died. But that was not true. He was in another ship. But however, this news was such an acute mental trauma for his father that probably that is what gave him a heart attack and he died. So acute mental trauma can give rise to myocardial infarction because of that sudden narrowing. In the same way, a bout of anger, fright, or frustration can do it. The famous pathologist John Hunter, uh, an 18th century uh, pathologist, said that my life is in the hands of any rascal who chooses to put me in a passion. And true enough, he died suddenly in 1793 after participating in a violent argument at a faculty meeting. So acute mental trauma and anger, fright, or frustration may give rise to a myocardial infarction. Other factors which can do the same are unaccustomed exercise. Person is sedentary by habits, and he comes to know that sedentary life is bad, it's an unhealthy lifestyle, and he decides to take a vacation, 1 week vacation. And over there, in the hotel, there's a gym, and he goes there and takes heavy exercise. Now, this is unaccustomed for him. So hasten slowly. There's a way to build up. And for that, again, yogic postures are the best because you have plenty of relaxation built in between the postures. And you can start with very simple practices, as you would find on our YouTube channel in the practicals of Yes.01. The very first video is a graded approach to physical practices, starts with very simple practices with elaborate instructions for those simple practices. So please note down carefully because then you start searching all over and they say, I couldn't find it. There are playlists. There's a playlist called Yes.01 class recordings, practicals. So all these things should match. They may not be in the same sequence. The course was Yes.01. The practicals are there in that playlist. And if you go to that, the first video is graded approach day 1. That is the type of things you can start on day 1. Unaccustomed exercise. Hurry. Being in a great hurry. 3 things on your mind, rushing from one place to another. Sexual activity. Some people get that attack while having sexual activity in the bed, and that because that can also be in a way a type of stress which can lead to enjoyable stress maybe, but all the same it is stressful. Enjoyable things can be stressful. A famous stress physiologist Hans Selye said a passionate kiss can be as stressful as a painful blow. Now I put these 3 factors together for a reason. Spasm may be induced by smoking, a single heavy high fat meal, and exposure to cold. Now, a single heavy high fat meal, again, it is important because, and I should have put one thing more, alcohol, perhaps. But anyway, these 3 are good enough to illustrate the point that I'm making. A single heavy high fat meal. People think that, well, diet can do harm. High fat diet is not good for heart. But then just one meal once in a while, what will it do? But in fact, a single heavy high fat meal can precipitate a spasm, and that's how it can do it. And along with that, smoking, drinking, exposure to cold, anger, etc., all those things put together. Now imagine a person who went to a party and he smoked there, he drank there, he got into a heated argument with someone there, if not a heated argument, at least some animated talk, and he took a single heavy high fat meal there, and it was cold, the hall was warm, his car is warm, but as he's walking from the party back to the parking lot, he gets exposed to cold, he gets into the car, feels quite all right while driving home, and at night he gets a heart attack and maybe dead the next morning. Incidentally, the maximum deaths occur during the first heart attack. That is the most fatal. So this might be his first heart attack, and he may die. And people say, oh, he was alive till yesterday evening. We saw him at a party. He was hale and hearty. What happened? All of a sudden, he's dead. It is because of the spasm. At his age, with his lifestyle, probably he had a partial block because of the fatty deposits in the arteries. He was not physically active. He was a very sedentary person, had all these unhealthy things in his lifestyle anyway, smoking, drinking, etc. He was perhaps also overweight. All these things were there. But in his sedentary life, the heart was still able to meet its demands, but the blocks had been developing because he was physically inactive. No collaterals had developed. And that night at that party, it was a fatal night. He had a combination of all these factors which can induce spasm. And then the person is dead the next morning. These type of cases are actually more common than the type of cases in which the person is physically active and then has a sudden death during the physical exertion, like Raju Srivastav recently. So that type of deaths are less common than these deaths, which happen suddenly in a person who was apparently hale and hearty, and then suddenly he's dead. And quite often happens at night. So now here put all the factors put together so far that we have talked about. Spasm, which may be superimposed on a partial block, may be induced by acute mental trauma, anger, fright, or frustration, unaccustomed exercise, being in a hurry, sexual activity, smoking, a single heavy high fat meal, exposure to cold. Okay. Now we come to the sports paradox. How can a person who engages in sports, who is a who has done quite a bit of heavy physical activity like jogging and weightlifting and so on, and all the types of gymnastics in a gym, suddenly he dies during the activity itself? How it can happen? One of the most plausible explanations is that because of this regular physical activity, his heart muscle had become thicker. The wall of his heart was thicker, which is a good thing because then he has the capacity to pump more blood with each beat. We saw that his stroke volume can be higher than a normal person. Instead of the usual 100, he can go up to 140 or 150 milliliters with each stroke. So it is good. But there's a price to pay for it. This thicker muscle also needs a greater blood supply. The thicker muscle means that it needs a greater blood supply. And therefore, if for some time, suppose he has been inactive, he is quite active, but not continuously. For a few months, he has not been doing anything. For a few years, he has not been doing anything. Physically relatively inactive, sedentary. And then he says, earlier I used to do this. What is the problem? I'll go and do it again. And he straight away starts with heavy physical activity. Now, there has been a deconditioning. The body has lost its adaptation. And suddenly he's in a bout of very heavy exercise. And this thick muscle, which was a benefit, which was of an advantage, becomes a handicap. Therefore, his imbalance between supply and demand can develop much faster than if he had a thinner heart requiring less blood. So this is one of the reasons why this activity. So it may be done after a long time or even otherwise, suddenly going from rest to heavy activity instead of going through a transition of a warm-up, that can do it. And apart from that, there could be other things which one never knows. Maybe there was some stress going on in his mind. Maybe he was exposed to cold. Maybe he smoked a cigarette before starting the activity in the gym. Now, all these things we do not know what all was going on and what all happened to that person. So all these things could account for what happens. But then, and one of the some other reasons which have been pointed out in the literature are that he might have blockages which had been ignored or underdiagnosed. There may be a sudden electrical disturbance in the heart, or there may be some fatty plaques, that are deposits which ruptured, and the blood vessel itself, some blood vessels ruptured. But the most plausible explanation to my mind remains twofold. Firstly, the exercise was not very regular, and he had been taking it off and on and built up some capacity, but it was not very regular. And secondly, the imbalance between supply and demand could happen much faster in this person because the demands were heavy, because the wall of the heart was much thicker than is in normal persons. Now, what are the risk factors for coronary artery disease? This type of heart disease: genetic predisposition or a tendency. Now, genetic predisposition only gives a tendency to develop the heart disease. The actual expression can come early or late, depending upon the lifestyle. So both these things are important. Genetics is something we can't change. and therefore we call it a non-modifiable risk factor. Unhealthy lifestyle has a number of modifiable risk factors like exercise, diet, smoking, drinking, sleep, and mental stress. Now, these are the modifiable risk factors. Mental stress, I said last, but actually it is the most important because it can override the effect of physical factors. Now, you might say, well, why not fight also genetic tendency? These days we have gene therapy available. Now, firstly, those things are more in the news than in practice even today. Secondly, what is even more important is this is not a single gene disease. So you replace the defective gene by the right gene. These are multigenic or polygenic inheritances. A large number of genes together contribute to a mere tendency to develop the disease. And in fact, an epidemiologist of great repute, Walter Willett, has calculated using certain algorithms which would be more effective and more cost effective gene therapy for this type of polygenic inheritance or correcting the lifestyle. And he says that any that adopting a healthy lifestyle wins hands down. That can be much, much more effective, and cost-wise, it need to cost nothing. So don't worry about your genes. Don't blame your parents. That's only a tendency. The tendency can be delayed. And if you can delay the tendency to 80 years instead of developing a heart disease at 40, suppose your parents got it at 50 or 60, you can accelerate the process and develop it at 40, or delay the process and develop it at 80. If it happens at 80, anyway, sooner or later one has to go because of something. So then essentially you overcome that tendency. So that is the proper way to look at it instead of blaming the genes or our parents. And the tendency these days, not this genetic tendency, the trend these days is to develop it at an earlier age. If the father got it at 60, the child develops it at 40 because the lifestyle is becoming more and more unhealthy. And this has prompted a famous cardiologist, again, one of videos on him is available, I think it was Dane Ornish, who said that this generation will probably be the first generation which will have a lower life expectancy than its parent generation. Because you see, in countries like the United States, they reached a life expectancy of 80. And because of the increase in lifestyle diseases and the mother of all lifestyle, obesity. Obesity is a major community problem in the West, and it is developing assuming the same proportions in the urban elite in India. So this development of these lifestyle diseases, which are obvious in the form of increased prevalence of obesity, overweight, morbid overweight, grossly overweight, which is showing up in that, this may make this generation live less than its parents. What is the treatment? The basic approach is match demand and supply. Either increase the demand or reduce the supply. Sorry, reduce the demand or increase the supply, or do both, so that one doesn't get into the situations of mismatch. Say in angina, person is told to put a tablet under the tongue that dilates the blood vessels, the supply increases. So the pain goes away. So, you match demand and supply. Regular exercise, but know when to stop. You should know when the challenge is such that you can't cope with it. You need not go beyond it. Going beyond it may be dangerous. But at the same time, keep challenging yourself with regular exercise. Increase the supply in one step. There are two main procedures known: PTCA technically, which stands for percutaneous transluminal coronary angioplasty, generally called just an angioplasty, or putting a stent. Now, what is done is we put a stent, which means a tube-like thing, generally metallic, which opens up the blood vessels, which had become narrow. So we put it at a critical spot where that opening will improve the blood flow. It's called percutaneous, that is through the skin, because one doesn't have to cut open the chest for it. And that's why one doesn't have to go to a thoracic surgeon. Many cardiologists also do PTCA or angioplasty, they put a stent. The second is CABG, which stands for coronary artery bypass grafting. We bypass the obstacle. How? By grafting another tube or blood vessel. Where do we get it from? Generally from the leg veins, because there, taking a piece of a vein can still leave the leg circulation fairly satisfactory. Now, this one-step process is an acute process, as in case of high blood pressure, taking a pill. and it may be necessary sometime. It may buy the person time. But then, if the lifestyle continues to be as it was, there can be a recurrence after angioplasty and there can be a recurrence after the bypass. And the way to prevent that is lifestyle changes. If the person was a chain smoker, first thing to do would be to give up smoking. And I've known people who were chain smokers who uh, were such compulsive smokers that they found it very difficult to give up smoking. Once they went through one of these procedures, they found it very easy. They gave it up in one stroke, no gradual reduction from 10 to 5, 5 to 3 cigarettes per day, and so on. In one stroke, they gave up because they wanted to no recurrence of the disease. So recurrence can be there after a stent, it can be there after a bypass. Because in spite of the stent, there can be block in some other artery, which is the stent is not there, or in the artery where the stent is there, but at a position where the stent will not help. Bypass, there may be an obstruction also in the vessel that has been grafted. So these are some of the things which I thought would be useful for the general public to know about heart disease. Some of it you'll find discussed in this book, The Human Machine. It's a book, the first edition of which came out in 1990, and the book is still in print. So for a book to continue for more than 30 years itself puts it on the path of becoming a modern day classic. And this book seems to be going the same way, Back to Health Through Yoga, which is a Rupa publication. And don't expect that this will tell you which postures will correct which disease. That would be only a 10-page book. This is a book that has 400 pages. And 400 pages because it looks at yoga in a very comprehensive way. It has 7 chapters on lifestyle, comprehensive view of lifestyle, and another 7 on lifestyle diseases. And the approach to yoga is all encompassing, the type of approach we have in integral yoga. So Back to Health Through Yoga, this seems to be going the same way. The first edition came out in 2008. After 14 years, it continues to be in print. This is a picture postcard view of Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch, the place where I live and work. And you're all welcome here. If you have any questions or comments, we already shot 10 minutes beyond time. So I'm not sure whether there'll be enough time for enough questions today, but you can always send an email to yes@yesspirituality.com. Gratitude to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for making these sessions possible. And thank you all for being there.
And we can just take up a few questions which are in the chat box. So the first question is, why do South Asians have higher rates for heart diseases, even if they follow active lifestyle and healthy diet?
Well, I'll not pay too much attention to the even if part, but certainly in general, South Asians are more prone. South Asians who have migrated to developed countries like the UK and the US, South Asians who have seen a sudden reduction in their poverty and so-called improvement in nutrition within one generation, they are the ones who are more prone, which means that people who have lived in a situation of scarcity for a long time and suddenly were in a situation of plenty, whether by migrating to a developed country or through their business or whatever they did in their parent country, and through that they became rich. The common human tendency that when a person is prosperous, he tries to become less physically active. You have a car available for everything, and you take to a diet which is more prestigious and expensive because you can afford it. And more prestigious and expensive and palatable diet means refined foods, high fat, and non-vegetarian food, alcohol, and so on. And this type of people, in spite of the wealth, also develop more stress sometimes, partly because they forget their spiritual roots. In the process, they get intoxicated by the newfound wealth. And the result is that they get more prone because the body had adapted for many generations, for several generations, their body had adapted to a situation of scarcity. And that is why it perhaps happens. This is one of the hypotheses why these people are more prone to develop a disease, why they are more prone to it. So it may not be purely genetic. It is probably, even if it's partly genetic, quite a bit is because of these sociological changes that I was talking about.
Does BP cause blindness? Is it temporary or irreversible?
Now, let's not use words loosely. BP does not cause blindness. High blood pressure, not blood pressure itself. High blood pressure poses some risk for developing blindness because of retinopathy. Atherosclerosis, the fatty deposit is a generalized process. It can affect retinal arteries. Some people may be more prone to develop it in the retina than at other places. Or the person may develop diabetes, which also a person with high blood pressure and heart disease is more prone to. And retinopathy is a major risk factor in diabetes. So all this is a cluster of diseases. And in this cluster, what comes first, what comes later, will depend on the individual, what the weak point was. But yes, certainly high blood pressure is a risk factor for developing retinopathy, which can lead to blindness. And therefore, as in diabetes, so in high blood pressure, one of the things is that when the high blood pressure has been detected, one should go for a regular eye checkup, which includes the fundus examination. Fundus means looking into the eye at the inside of the eye, the layer, where the receptors are, where we have the receptors for being able to see that part. That is where the blood supply, uh, reduction in blood supply can be seen. That is our mirror to the blood supply of the heart, so of the eye. So regular eye checkup once a year, the eye checkup, which includes fundus examination.
Why strenuous physical exercises such as marathon running and weightlifting increase liver parameters like AST and ALT in some athletes, and how serious it is and how we can prevent?
Well, again, it's not their regular physical activity which gives them an abnormal lipid profile. Hmm? The two could be quite independent. The lipid profile may be affected mainly by the genes, whereas their health is more affected by their lifestyle. And that is why you find this type of paradoxes also, that one person with a blood cholesterol level of 200 may get a heart attack, and another person with a blood cholesterol of 400 may be blissfully unaware of it and goes about freely without any symptoms. Which means that the blood lipid profile, which is partly affected by genes and partly by the body weight, these are the two major factors, uh, which means that not what we eat, but how much we eat becomes more important in this context. So eat the right amount, take regular physical activity, and then leave the cholesterol levels to the interaction between your healthy lifestyle and the genes. And still, some people, rare people, may have a pretty high blood cholesterol, 300, 400. The healthy lifestyle will not be able to overcome it entirely. But then the disease is not because of the figures, because of the figures of the blood cholesterol level. It is because of the development of deposits. This person still may not develop the deposits at the same rate. If he can delay the expression in spite of high cholesterol to the age of 80, as I said, everything has been achieved. So he may go around till the age of 80, and this tendency, which he knew all along is because of the high blood cholesterol, may show up only at the age of 80. So that is quite possible. So that is why we are not treating just as we don't treat angiograms, we treat people. We don't treat blood cholesterol levels, we treat people. That should be the dictum.
Uh, can you please talk about preeclampsia and how BP increases in this condition?
Yes, I think that question was told in anticipation that it will be asked. Uh, that actually is a little more technical questions which a gynecologist can answer better, perhaps. But briefly, I mean, it is basically the hormonal changes that take place during pregnancy, which increase also the possibility of a rise in blood pressure. And this type of blood pressure invariably comes down after the delivery. But occasionally it can develop into eclampsia, which can be a serious condition. And that, of course, needs emergency intervention by the gynecologist, depending upon the situation, whether to try and save both the mother and the baby or to try to save the mother, even if the baby can't be saved. That can happen in eclampsia. But preeclampsia, by and large, it can be taken care of with a few simple measures like a salt-free diet and so on and so forth. So those are the things, and it's temporary during the pregnancy. After pregnancy, generally everything returns to normal, and it may be not only increase in blood pressure, it may also be an increase in the blood glucose levels. Gestational diabetes is also known. So again, it is a cluster. It's the metabolic changes that are taking place during pregnancy because of the hormonal fluctuations. And the uh, uh, hormones which go up in levels, the estrogens and progesterone, these have a close resemblance to the steroid hormones. And for some of the physiological effects are overlapping. And that could be one reason why in some people, this type of hormonal changes may give some of the changes which take place otherwise as in lifestyle disorders such as high blood pressure and diabetes. So some of those changes in a rudimentary form, early form, may develop also during pregnancy because of these hormonal changes. And uh, of course, during the pregnancy, some care is required because the baby should not get affected by these metabolic changes in the mother, and therefore uh, it does need attention. But by and large, with that attention, the pregnancy proceeds smoothly and the baby is delivered normally. And after pregnancy, the woman's parameters are also back to normal. However, it can serve as a warning for her that she's more prone to it, so she can adopt a still more healthy lifestyle than she had earlier, so that another 10 or 20 or 30 years later, she did not come down with one of these lifestyle diseases. So that would be sort of a physiologist's approach to a gynecological problem.
Just one last question in the chat box. Why a person with no history of hypertension also gets cardiac arrest? Is it because of the stressful lifestyle?
Yes, again, it's a balance uh, between the supply and demand. And therefore, a person may have no high blood pressure and still may develop a heart disease due to one of those several factors that we talked about. Uh, Unhealthy lifestyle leading to a process which had been going on for 30, 40 years. In this person, he was not prone to high blood pressure because of some genetic reasons, perhaps. And then one of those factors leading to acute spasm superimposed on on a partial block can give a heart attack. So, I mean, we have understood sort of the large number of variables involved in this process, and therefore you can understand that no two people need follow exactly the same type of a clinical picture or the history of development of disease. The disease may evolve in different ways in different people, and the one disease may be there, another may not be there. All that is possible.
All right, that is all the questions we have in the chat box. Maybe we can end today's session with a moment of silence